We recently passed the 1 year anniversary of George Floyd's death. We already had the trial, Officer Derek Chauvin, as covered on this channel, and as you've probably seen on every mainstream media outlet, was found guilty on all counts to which he was charged. And now I want to discuss the legacy of George Floyd, or the aftermath of the death of George Floyd. Because it's one thing to argue about whether or not the state actually proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt. It's one thing to argue about the procedures that the Minneapolis Police Department trains their officers with, or whether or not a juror or jurors actually came in with preconceived notions about the Chauvin case, and thus signed, sealed, and delivered his fate as soon as they were placed on the jury. That all can be set aside for now and talked about another time. I have videos on all of that, and you can review that, because regardless, I've always maintained that I understand the outrage that resulted from the original video related to George Floyd. Now, we can discuss the autopsy, this, that, or the other thing, but none of that, in terms of the public consciousness, will ever hold the same weight as that original video, because remember, it took 2 months for the body cam footage to come out. Before that, all we had was a couple of pages of an autopsy report in a nation where the population isn't very scientifically literate. So I always understood the outrage. Now, there's no excuse at all whatsoever for the rioting. If you're angry at a Minneapolis police officer and you destroy and loot your neighborhood across the country, that makes absolutely no sense, and it's morally reprehensible, and anybody who excuses it in any way, shape, or form is morally reprehensible. But I understood the initial outrage around the Floyd case. Now, with that being said, there is aftermath, there is fallout, there is consequences for the outrage that we saw in the public. And one of the biggest consequences is this mainstreaming of the idea that we should be defunding or abolishing our police departments. And it's had real results. Departments across the country, due to COVID and due to the fact that there are just less candidates, are having recruitment problems. At the same time, they are seeing a lot of people go into early retirement, more than is typical at these time periods during the same year. Now, this combination of early retirement and light recruitment will have negative consequences for the future of these police departments. Even if it picks up as normal in a couple of years, you're still going to have a set year that is going to be short on qualified candidates. And ironically, one of the negative consequences of this is that those unqualified candidates are more likely to make mistakes during the course of their jobs as police officers, which can often lead to deadly outcomes. This also increases the chances of corruption, because when you have a lot of candidates coming into your department, you can be more selective as to the background checks that you're running, so you can pick out the most ideal candidates that will less likely lead to economic or other types of corruption in the department.
Across the U.S., murders have skyrocketed this year, while nonviolent offenses have largely dropped. That is according to publicly available crime data.
Now, while that's one issue, that's not to be confused with the issue of the severe uptick in murders that we've seen in major metropolitan areas and rural communities across the country. Now, a lot of people are reporting this as a rise in overall crime, but actually this does not appear to be the case. Petty crimes and economic crimes that people would expect to go up during economically tough times are actually down or at about the same levels. The increase that we're seeing is in homicides, and the most affected communities by these homicides are, of course, Black communities. The same communities that, of course, Black Lives Matter purports to exist to protect. I'm going to go to this story that I saw on PBS because I think it's actually very instructive of what we're talking about. I'm going to go into the overall numbers later on in the video, but honestly, I think one anecdote might be sufficient to get my point across, because there's something that I want to talk about that is separate from numbers.
Kalila Corey's 19-year-old son, Wanye, dreamed of becoming a journalist. In his free time, he loved playing basketball in their Minneapolis neighborhood.
That's kind of how, my neighborhood got to know us. I was the mother, the single mother with 5, and the boys outside playing basketball.
On October 11th, Corey got a text from Wanye saying he was heading home after playing at a nearby court.
It was my middle child's birthday. He was turning 12. And later on that day, we were going to celebrate at home like we do. We were waiting for Wanye to come. when he didn't come, it was devastating.
Wanye had been killed in a drive-by shooting.
This is not an isolated incident. Murders have risen in the city of Minneapolis to 1990s levels.
Minneapolis, still reeling from this summer's police killing of George Floyd, has had 80 murders so far this year, a level not seen since the 1990s. Despite the uptick, the Minneapolis City Council voted unanimously earlier this month to shift nearly $8 million from next year's police budget. I mean, what do you think happened?
I don't even know. I mean, just from what I'm hearing from, like, you know, the police, like, mistaken identity. Like, what happened to him is unexplainable. They don't have any leads.
Now, I don't know anything about this woman's son other than the things that she stated about him during the course of this PBS segment, which I actually recommend you guys watch. It will be linked down in the description below. But this is a horrific, tragic event for a family to deal with. This happened on the same day that the middle child in this woman's family was turning 12 years old. Now, I've actually experienced burying a loved one on my birthday, and I can tell you, even though I was twice this kid's age, it has a significant impact. And we don't typically discuss the impact of the statistics that we're often quoting in relation to crime. What makes this even worse or better, I don't even know, is that it appears that this person was killed due to mistaken identity. So the murder was over nothing.
Tragically, Kalila Corey has felt this pain before. She grew up on Chicago's West Side and lost two brothers to gun violence. She says she moved her family to Minneapolis 6 years ago in hopes of giving her children a better life.
So it's more trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. And I don't want my kids to live in fear.
Now, she is 100% right about this. It is a trauma on top of a trauma, and there's only so much that human beings can actually bear. And I do want to commend her because she saw the state of the neighborhood that she lived in Chicago, and rather than just getting bogged down in the tragedies in her life, she wanted to change her circumstances for her children so that they could have a better shot. I'm always somebody who admires people who seek to make a change from something that happened to them during the course of their childhood or their development for the future generations. For example, if you were hit as a child and you choose not to hit your children while you're raising them, I think that's incredibly commendable. It is so easy to get bogged down and normalize poor behavior and assume that just because it happened to you, that makes it normal. This woman did not want to live that way, and that makes this story infinitely more tragic, that she moved her kids out to this other neighborhood that used to be safer, and it's reverting and going the way of Chicago. And again, these are not my words, these are her words from the segment.
Now I'm even more scared to even, leave the house, take the kids out, because it's been so much violence, like so much. I feel like I'm back in Chicago.
And she says life now seems unimaginable without her oldest son.
And this is what I want to focus on. This guy was the eldest of 5. He has 4 siblings that are surviving his death and have to go out in the world with the trauma of their eldest brother being shot in what appears to be a random drive-by shooting. And there's a reason that people who come back from wars develop post-traumatic stress disorder. It's because you're not supposed to experience these horrors in your life, and it's shocking for people in modern Western society to experience it. However, it's not that shocking for certain communities across this country, and it has an impact. Those are 4 siblings that are going to have a skewed view of the value of life. It appears that their elder brother was doing everything right. He wasn't getting himself into trouble. He was a role model for him, and yet his life was still tragically cut short. His actions from the surface of this story didn't really impact the outcome in his life, and that's a horrible lesson for kids to take with them growing up. But it's not just one story, one family in one city. It's a phenomenon that's occurring across this country. In 2019, the city of New York saw 319 murders. In a city of 8.5 million, that's actually fantastic. However, in 2020, as the NYPD was pulling back from so many different communities, because for some reason the NYPD needs to be punished because of an officer's actions in the city of Minneapolis, the murders went up in raw numbers to 468. That's about a 47% increase in homicides in the city that I live in. That's not to mention the dramatic increase in shootings in my city, which are also up, and 70% of those shootings remain unsolved. This is largely due to the fact that New York State passed bail reform, so everybody gets out of jail the next day without paying a penny, even though a lot of the crimes that are covered under this bail reform are violent crimes. And because Bill de Blasio decided that it was a good idea to remove the NYPD's plainclothes anti-crime unit, which is designed specifically to deter shootings in New York City. And the reason Bill de Blasio gave for removing this unit is because he said this unit statistically was way more likely to shoot suspects, which should surprise nobody that the unit specifically aimed at targeting illegal guns is more likely to have officer-involved shootings because, again, the subjects of those units have a more likelihood to have guns. But again, we're not just talking about the extra 150 murders in New York City that died largely due to bad leftist policy. We're talking about the impact that has on the family members of those murdered people. If you're getting shot up and there's no legitimate reason to suspect the NYPD will even solve the shooting because the officers are being pulled back in times of crisis, you're going to have a skewed view of law enforcement, government, and of morality. You're learning through what you see around you that life is not valuable within these communities. Ironically, again, these are largely Black communities in New York City, so you're actually undercutting the value in the eyes of the people in that community of Black lives. And that has serious repercussions and negative consequences. All of these people that were murdered had friends, they had family, they had people that cared about them. Even if they're gang members involved in gang shootings, they have other gang members that seek out revenge on their behalf after they're killed. This is how violence can become cyclical because people are constantly devaluing life, they're experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're going after each other time and time again. The violence is perpetuating itself because there's no arbiter there to cut it off at the knees. 150 more murders this year can lead to even more murders the next year. And two of the most tragic things about this is that A, it doesn't have to be this way, and B, we're doing this based on uninformed people who want to save non-existent lives that are in danger. We have polling data on what people think, depending on their political party, the rate of unarmed Black people being killed by the police actually is. And it turns out that far leftists, who are the most supportive of organizations like Black Lives Matter, believe that Black people are more likely to be killed when they're unarmed by the police than they are to die in car accidents. Think about how asinine that is. If you want a visual representation of my point, this graph that I made for you is of the difference in unarmed Black people being killed by the police and Black people dying in car accidents. So the left thinks that this number is greater than this number in dangerously high numbers. And the insane thing about this is that we're making policy decisions based on people's misunderstanding of these facts. We're sacrificing hundreds, if not thousands of lives, the majority of them Black lives, in order to save thousands of lives that are not dying at the hands of the police. The real number in any given year is around 25 people. And a lot of those people who are claimed to be unarmed are in vehicles, driving those vehicles at police officers, or they had no arms, but they're trying to arm themselves with the police officer's gun and or taser. So the real number might be less than 10. And again, we're sacrificing hundreds, if not thousands of people in order to save those 10. And again, those 10 might not be unjustified even if they were unarmed. There's a video that came out in what they now call, for some reason, George Floyd Square in Minneapolis. That was a perfect distillation of the legacy of the death of George Floyd. And I'm not putting it on the man himself. I'm putting it on the people who opportunistically latched onto this death in order to further their own radical leftist and outright ridiculous agenda. And in that video, when they're covering this story, shots are being fired from a drive-by shooting.
This bill of comprehensive police reform just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us. It sounds like gunshots. I'll let you know what this is. These seem to be gunshots. Shit, where was that?
We're okay.
And while I hope that nobody was struck, seriously injured, or killed by the reported 30 gunshots that were fired during the course of that news segment, it is the perfect distillation of the legacy of the death of George Floyd. And in one more sad, twisted irony, of course, youth gun violence in the black community was one of the chief concerns of the man himself.
Just saw my homegirl Nikki from South Lawn lost her son, man. Our young generation is clearly lost, man. Clearly lost, man. Like, I don't even know what to say no more, man. Like, you youngsters just going around, just busting guns in crowds, kids getting killed, and it's clearly the generation after us, man, that's so lost, man.
Now, that's all I really have for you guys today. My apologies if you weren't expecting such a down video, but honestly, this is what I think about the legacy of the death of George Floyd and the aftermath, consequences, whatever. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. You guys know the drill with the liking, sharing, subscribing. I don't want to run through that. Till next time.